Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Broadcast Revolution's latest event, where today we're going to explore the #1 news show in the UK, the BBC Radio 4's Today programme. And as you can see, delighted to say that we've got a former editor of the programme, Sarah Sands, joining us. Thank you for being here today, Sarah. And again, as you can see, you'll be in the capable hands of our very own Mike Young, who, as you can also hear, his previous life was on the BBC and the likes of the Radio 4 You and Yours show and 5 Live Drive. Producing shows there. Some of the things Mike and Sarah are going to be discussing, what was it like to edit the Today programme? What makes it so influential and how it leads the daily news agenda? And for me, one of the most interesting questions I'm looking forward to hearing Sarah's views on is, why are brands so scared about offering their chief execs, who should know everything they should know about their business, to be interviewed on the Today programme and other big outlets like that? As always, do get your questions in. If you can pop them in via Twitter, that'd be great, at Broadcast Revo, and get involved in the conversation on Twitter, hashtag Join the Broadcast Revolution. And again, our Instagram is open and welcome for all your content, Broadcast Revolution. So with I'll now hand over to Mike and Sarah.
Thank you very much. And I should quickly add, everyone who asks a question of us, by the way, automatically gets entered into a quarterly draw for a free Broadcast for Good campaign. That's where we'll deliver a free campaign to a charity of your choice on your behalf. This will be drawn at the end of this month. So just a reminder, you can ask a question via Twitter at Broadcast Revo, or you can ask a question or join the chat using the hashtag Join the Broadcast Revolution. Sarah Sands then, until early last year, the editor of Radio 4's flagship Today programme. Before that, editor of the London Evening Standard and the Sunday Telegraph. She was deputy editor of the Daily Telegraph, consultant editor at the Daily Mail, and in her spare time wrote 3 novels. Our focus really today, though, as Phil has been saying, is the time at the Today programme. And Sarah, I suppose I wanted to kind of start with that. And how did you come to apply for, what inspired you to apply for that role? We're talking back in late 2016 into 2017, and actually get the role of editor of the Today programme.
Yes, it's a question that some people at the BBC might have been asking, actually. And as you know, the process is done through boards and so on, but I wasn't looking for it. I was very happy at the Evening Standard. It was a very nice job. It's very nice being a newspaper editor. I had a fabulous office, and but when I was asked about the Today programme, I thought about it a bit. I asked my husband what he thought, and I said, look, I'm thinking about a job at the BBC, and he said, yes, fine, as long as it's not the Today programme. And I went, no, it's the Today programme. So I think we know that, what it brings with it is, a ton of sort of scrutiny and a sort of responsibility, sort of strangely, sort of responsibility without power, in the way that perhaps newspapers are slightly the other way around. But it's the Today programme, so of course I had to do it. So I then did a couple of boards, and but it was initially an approach from James Harding and Tony Hall.
Yeah, it gives you an idea of the military background and arrangement of the BBC that they call job interviews boards. It always feels quite disciplined and old-fashioned in a Reithian sort of way, the BBC. Yeah. You'd never worked at the BBC before starting as editor of Today. Take us back to that sort of early 2017. What was your first day like?
Well, first day was terrible, because I'd so it was sort of a culture shock. I came in, with this tremendously sort of romantic, Reithian vision of the BBC. I was, brought up on the World Service, so I thought it was, tremendous sort of honour to be there. I was like quite surprised when I'd got there that, although people are dedicated to this, to this wonderful organisation, they do complain quite a lot. And I think there was, naturally quite a lot of suspicion of why I got the job, that it's one of the jobs that, is very sought after. They don't come up often. There are far too many people, for each job. Everyone's on this sort of circle of hell of attachments at the BBC. So I think, and I'd come from, a sort of barbarian culture of newspapers. So on the first day, it was mostly, this figure was sort of hovering over me, which turned out to be the head of press. who just had this sort of constant, oh, we've just had an inquiry from the Mail, we've just had an inquiry from the Guardian, all about sort of terrible solecisms that I'd been committing. And I was sort of looking around, you really did feel that you were like a, sort of governess with the children all putting spiders in your beds. But actually after, but I think, with a bit of kind of just mutual respect, I just had to sort of earn the trust. I had a very, very suspicious John Humphreys as the main presenter, but we, became, I think, great friends and allies, actually. So I think you just have to, know what you have to learn, but also be fairly confident about what you can do and what you can bring. Because that's another thing about the BBC, again, difference with newspapers is that, on the whole, newspapers, as long as you're not sort of breaking the law, you're free to do as you like. Whereas the BBC, you're very constrained by, various rules, and you're also have this, everyone has an opinion. It's like being a sort of football manager or something. And it was when I realized that a lot of the sort of criticisms that were coming in were from internal emails rather than out. So I think, what's going on here? But it is that thing, that it feels it belongs to everyone. And that's rather a marvelous thing.
I left the BBC in March, and I think the editorial guidelines were about that thick by the time I left. And I remember starting and they were maybe half that sort of thing. How much of those were a hindrance to you? How tough was it to kind of get up to the editorial speed that you needed to be at the BBC? Because there are so many checks and balances.
There are checks and balances. And so I think what you have to be careful of is that you're not just, so second guessing everything that you're not being proactive. And I think that's the great, I guess, dilemma for the BBC, that it wants to be it wants to break news. It wants to, and often it does, but it where it's probably safest is in those sort of world events, where it, has a reporter on standby. Some of those investigations, well, as we know, from the Martin Bashir sort of calamity, that when it, tries to do a kind of newspaper agenda, and was, extremely neglectful about the means to it. I mean, sort of wickedly neglectful. Then, that's what can happen. So I think it's, so what I missed from newspapers was a sense of mischief, that you could just do stories because it was sort of fun. Whereas, you had to really think of every story you were doing, of its, parameters, its balance, its, constant sense of sort of impartiality. But actually, it wasn't. I think if you're a journalist, on the whole, you want to do the story. Not many journalists are tremendously ideological. It's why they move from paper to paper or organisation to organisation. So I think there was a great suspicion that I'd come in as a sort of terrible, sort of Tory spy. And in fact, my position is always, if it's a good story, it's a good story.
Where do you stand on the BBC and its impartiality? How did you find it? What was your view of the impartiality of the BBC in your experience when you were there?
I think it is as much as you can possibly do, with it. You can't sort of police people's thoughts. And so in the end, the first thing I did actually when I left was go and join up with Index on Censorship, and I do some work with them, because actually the sense of just being able to sort of speak freely is a wonderful thing. I think there was, when I was there, towards the end, there was a big clamping down on Twitter for the particularly the presenters, and I think that was probably right, because I think that's sort of encouraging you to say things because you'll get a good response to it. So it's a slightly sort of professional vanity route, which does distract from the main point. So I do like the idea that you shouldn't know what people think or how they vote. And I think that the balance is very important. It's what the trouble is. It's what people hear. And another thing about the Today programme, as I used to say very indignantly, is it's 3 hours long. There is balance, throughout, but people would hear one thing, and then maybe not something that balanced it later on, because amazingly they weren't listening to every second from 6 o'clock. And so so people became very aggrieved, and some people did. and also because it was a period that was, it was a huge sort of political war, sort of post-Brexit. So it really mattered to people, if they heard a view that they thought was, could disprove or wasn't sympathetic to their view, particularly on Brexit.
I want to ask as many people's questions as possible. They're coming through on @BroadcastRevo, our Twitter account. We were talking about impartiality there. From John here, do you think that potential government tampering with the BBC would threaten the independence of programmes like Today?
Well, it's an interesting question. While I was there was a boycott on the Today programme, and which still sort of mystified me.
Ordered by who? Do you know? Was that from the very top at Downing Street?
I think it was Dominic. Yeah. So the very top. And that was on election night. Huge majority for the Prime Minister. So I just put in my check call at 4 a.m. Looking great. Soon we'll have the Prime Minister, and was told, no, you're not getting anyone. And so it was just, so it was a sort of strange kind of punishment beating for no reason except to be sort of disruptive and a bit aggressive. And then it was sort of lifted actually through sort of pragmatism on their side, and because it's who holds the power is always interesting. And so of course they made the point that we don't need to come on the Today programme, and that's something actually I always would remind producers of, that I may think it's a democratic duty, but you can't physically make someone come on the Today programme. So you've got to kind of think of what the sort of balance of interests are. And I think what happened with the boycott was that eventually we didn't have government politicians, so we started, and actually at the time, because it was during the sort of final Corbyn period, you didn't actually have much of an opposition either. What we did have was news of this strange thing going on in Wuhan, and a lot of scientists who were interested. So we started to get those on, and actually the programme altered so much for the better, because we'd got probably into a bit of a sort of standoff with the government, and they so I wouldn't say we were faultless. I think some of the interrupting is annoying for listeners, and there was a slightly grandstanding at times part of the programme. So it sort of changed the tone. You had really good sort of inquiring interviews, because we didn't know and the scientists did, and then finally the government were looking. Actually, what we did have, we had Jeremy Hunt became a slightly sort of statesman-like figure during the time, and stood in for proxy for all kind of politicians of all persuasions.
You turn to the select committees, basically, don't you? And when you can't get a ministerial bottom on a seat,
who of course have become very sort of powerful and informed. So finally, the government just broke. They couldn't bear it anymore to just hear Jeremy Hunt and listeners saying how marvellous he was, and then things reverted to normal. But I think there is there is clearly a fundamental existential relationship between the BBC and the government, which is difficult, because they know that they're that they're the source of money, and so it is that thing slightly, are you there's a slight paranoia to the relationship, and are you at their throat or at their feet.
I used to work on 5 Live Breakfast. I produced that for 4 years, and our sort of assumption was that we were averaging about maybe 3 million listeners. Today programme, 7 million listeners. How persuasive do you think that is? I think some people forget that radio is king in the morning. If you're getting 7 million listeners to the Today programme, breakfast television is getting about 1.5 million viewers, something like that. It's pretty much top of the tree, isn't it, today, in terms of bums on seats, listeners wise?
Yes, it is. And I think that is to remember, because of course as everything fragments, and there are different and now different outlets that you can go on, many more than there were, and people consume news in a slightly different way. And there are there's Apple News, there's lots there is lots of good ways of getting news, but there is still for that just absolutely sort of mainstream a sense of it's not quite, I think it was Brown Redhead who said oh, it's a whispering in the nation's ear. And I remember using that once, quoting, and someone said quite irritably, you're not, you don't speak for the nation. And I think that's another kind of interesting question. And of course, one for the BBC as well. But I think what you can say is we can make the programme, the best it can be of bringing you, that day, kind of everything you need to know. And I very much went on the, if I had to think of a listener, I always thought of David Blunkett, because I remembered him saying when he was at School for the Blind, and that what was then the Home Service became Radio 4 was his education. So I thought, at the end, have you learnt enough? Have we covered this in a responsible, fair, and entertaining? But it's a really kind of Reithian exercise, actually.
Break down for us the key elements in the Today programme. What are the key ingredients of the programme for you?
Well, structurally, it's it's the 8:10, which is the sort of tends to be the big political interview. There's the first hour, because you get slightly different audiences. So we used to call the sort of boss slot, which was the 6:15 or actually just before 7, where you tended to get more of a sort of business audience. And then the sort of 7 to 8 was quite newsy and the sort of second. So the 7:50 is the second subject, then 8:10 the subject of the day, and then it becomes slightly more sort of discursive towards the 8:30 to 9, and then we're the only programme that has a sort of dedicated business. Of those news programs that has a dedicated business element, so I always thought that was an interesting thing, and also the time zone is good for business, obviously, an announcement of results and so on. So I always thought business was a big deal for the Today programme. And James Harding, who hired me, who was ex Times and ex City, so we had a sort of shared interest in business.
BBC has a business unit that kind of is the business sort of cathedral on one side, chipping in towards various programs. What role does it actually play? You talk about having a bespoke sort of business outfit for the Today programme. What role does the BBC business unit have in contributing content towards the Today programme?
Well, that's rather key, that question, because that was something that was slightly changing as I left. So you did have your own team. You had a Today programme business producer dedicated, and you had a dedicated business presenter. But also we had good relations with Simon Jack and the team. So you could sort of call on, so there's a slightly sort of client relationship that you can call on who you want, and everyone will want to come on the Today programme. But it was nice to have your own team, getting your own interviews and so on. But that's something that's now slightly changing, perfectly understandable for the BBC doing it, less interesting if you're an editor, which is to sort of centralise the commissioning more, so that I guess ideally it's to have a story that can, that's a package that can go on various programmes through the day.
I used to sit in meetings at midnight where all the producers would come in from the BBC and we would all be discussing what we had coming up in the next day's programme. With 5 Live, which I was on, I was always willing to throw out the entire running order and start again if there was big breaking news. How much do you think the Today programme is a breaking news programme, and how much do you think it actually stays true to what's always been planned, make some adjustments for whatever is happening? But is it a rolling news, a breaking news programme? How would you describe it to somebody?
Certainly try to be. I mean, I think that it and when a big story, what tends to happen is elections obviously are very, very good, and for the Today programme, if there's an overnight, I think there were probably, while I was there, a couple of big terrorist stories. There was Grenfell overnight. There was sometimes actually a sort of big death of, I think for us, Stephen Hawking, Robert Mugabe, or someone like that, and then so obviously we're all news people, and that's our favorite thing, when you can just throw stuff out. I think what tended to happen a bit was it's interesting, the relationship between broadcasting in the newspapers, and the newspapers are still very influential. And so you tend to think, oh, there's this story in the newspaper, should we change what we had for that? And actually that was something I would question, that that go on merit. If you've got a strong something of your own, don't throw it out just for the sake of it, because you wouldn't do that in a newspaper. You would be quite confident about your own things rather than chucking for arrivals. So I think ideally everyone would love to throw out things, but I think the two things I tried to introduce as a sort of slightly sensitive sort of discipline to the programme was one, go for quality, and that can take time to set up. And also, if you want to get guests on, particularly women actually, who don't feel that it's an imperative for them to be on, so they're not politicians, but they might be, scientists or in another field. Actually just phoning them at sort of 5 in the morning, or worse, phoning them late evening, then dropping them, it's just going to piss everyone off in the end. So, let's try and have a slightly more sort of considerate relationship with the people that we have on, and then have that mix of items that probably have taken longer to set up, and so don't have that, sort of immediacy, but a real sort of quality, lasting, stuff. So when you look back over the year at what you did, those are the ones you remember, probably, rather, than just rolling news, which tends to be forgotten.
What makes a good guest for the Today programme? And I remember noting when 5 Live Drive was one of the first programmes who basically said, we want a 50-50 gender split in our guests. So men and women were getting a much fairer crack at the whip, at 50-50 sort of. Is there a positive drive to try and get more female voices? You've alluded to it already. And what do you think is a great guest, regardless of gender, for the Today programme?
Yes, it's really interesting on the 50-50. I've been chairing a Gender Equality Advisory Council for G7, and we've got a report coming out in September. And one of the recommendations is on representation, and one on media portrayal, of women. And of course, that's related. And it does mean that, sort of short term, it can mean, which is the big question, I guess, for the BBC sort of generally, is, are you portraying the world as you want it to be, or sort of as it is, that, if computer scientists are 90% male, are we actually being sort of true to facts to kind of pick the one woman and, and make it, or should we just, represent things as we are? I was for getting more women, particularly more scientists on, because I did think that there was a, there's a role model element, and you want to hear people. And actually, if you do, what you were really aware, if you went for a whole sort of half hour and you hadn't heard a female voice, could easily happen unless you sort of actively address it. There's just a status quo that reasserts itself, and it just becomes pretty much, particularly because you're tending to deal with bosses, it becomes an all-male program very, very quickly. So I think we just had to keep working. I cheated sometimes, I would sort of bring in a women's hockey team or something just to get the numbers up. But in principle, I think it's the right thing to do. And I actually was really convinced by this Gender Equality Council, which is made up of a lot of international scientists and economists, including Dame Sarah Gilbert, and Sarah Gilbert herself did say, that she'd seen that there was a take up in pupils, girls, studying science because of her. She was really, sort of pleased and about that. And I think there is so there is a demonstrable effect on how, if girls never hear themselves discussed in certain, fields, they're not going to partake. So I do think there is a sort of evidence-based reason for doing those 50-50.
I've certainly never seen a bigger drive within the BBC for that gender split, or for female spokespeople coming through, and there's every reason to be offering a strong female spokesperson for whichever brand you are representing. Speaking of brands, what place is there for brands to participate on the Today programme?
Well, there is a role. I think you have to think of, there's a bit of risk and reward, and you have to think of, what you want to get out of it. you know, if it's part of it, where it works well for people is if it sort of goes into a sort of wider news story or a sort of political message. I'm trying to think of people who've been very good on the Today programme, people like John Holland Kay, I guess, you know, that you're, you know, you're the boss, but it's a big issue, should people fly or not? And so that, and it tends to be quite news based. I think, as with 5 Live, is it, you know, if it's results day, you come on, sort of thing. So what you tend not to get is, you know, to come and talk about the, you know, the extraordinary success of your company. You know, there'll be some pushback, and there'll always be a question about remuneration. There'll always be a question about, and the other thing that happens is, it's a very, you know, that everything's, I think, unlike other programs, still there is an all-night team who, you know, of incredibly hardworking producers who produce these sort of beautiful briefs with, you know, possible questions and answers and so on. So it's all kind of, so it's really planned and sort of thought through. And what that tends to be is that it looks up everything you've ever said about, you know, so just be aware that, you know, that you will be challenged probably on, you know, any discrepancy between what was said before and what was said now, and that, and it's a, you know, and you will be challenged. But it's so you know, think about that. You know, is it that you, as I say, if it goes into a bigger sort of political story or a news story that you know you want to be part of, and anything, you know, or if it's sort of pre-budget or something, and it becomes a wider issue, or you can shed light on an issue of. You know, is future of work or something. That can be something, you know, that one could do. You know, I would always recommend that last half hour, which is, like, as I say, particularly now because people, you know, are getting up a bit later in the new sort of hybrid model. So that tends to be where it's a bit more discursive, whereas earlier, you know, you're time driven. Always know if you're just before the hour, you know, they have to get to the pit, so they'll have to cut you off. So you may well, if we're running late on stuff, that's where the squeeze is. So bear that in mind, you know, when they suddenly go, well, I'm going to have to leave it there just when you were going to come out with your, you know, great line.
What do you say to brands who avoid the Today programme or avoid a Channel 4 News, for example? Because frankly, I think some people fear the Today programme. They fear that gladiatorial inquisitor sort of role that some presenters on the Today programme will try and espouse.
Yeah, you have to think of what the format is that would suit you. So, you know, it may be that there's other programmes. Actually, I always like the, was it Bottom Line, you know, the Evan Davis one, where you're actually talking about how companies are built in a more analytical, and you can take more time over it. You know, the main thing with the Today programme is it's quite packed, so there isn't that much time. And as I say, there will be a, you know, there'll be a challenge within it. So it's, but it has 7 million listeners, and it's tremendously influential, and you will be, so it depends who you want to be heard by, you know. So I think certainly give it some thought, and, you know, and sort of preparation, and, you know, and know what the, you know, where, what the presenter is going to pick up on. And you always, you know, hear, and you're always waiting for a news line. So that's what the editor's doing. You know, I remember listening yesterday, and Kenneth Clark was talking about spending, and then he said, you know, there's too much being spent on the Royal Yacht. And I thought, oh, that's the question, you know, go back on that one. And sure enough, you know, the presenter did, because obviously the editor had said, oh, you know, so you're always listening for, oh, you know, and that may be something that, you know, to the good, that you're prepared, that you want to discuss, but it may be something that it's, you know, so if you go, oh, and we've all just had our bonuses, but what I want to talk about, you know, they're going to go bonuses. You know, so just know, you know, what a news line is.
And that clip can go far and wide, because I mean, more and more now, you watch the 6 o'clock news in the evening on BBC One, and you'll see now a wonderful webcam has grabbed a wonderful InVision, nicely framed shot of someone on the Today programme, sometimes 12 hours earlier, and you're still part of the news cycle. I mean, if you say something of interest, it can run and run from that seat on the Today programme.
That's true. No, the clip is everything. And actually, I think, you know, my slight worry is that does that start to influence the way that people are interviewing, because they're all thinking of the clip. And certainly I've seen that on some of the other television channels. Of course, it happened slightly less during lockdown because you didn't have people in the studio. So that was sort of harder for them. You know, the ideal was in the studio, then you could clip it really quickly and get it out. But the clip is certainly was the sort of holy grail by the time that I left. So it doesn't make, I'm not entirely happy about it, as I say, because I think then you're just looking for that rather than the greater conversation. I mean, I still think, my test at the end of every program was, what have we learned? And I think that does demand, a sort of truthful probing, rather than doing things for show or for effect or for the clip.
I remember with 5 Live, it tended to be all about what we call a case study, the real person, the real voice very often. But what we actually see is CEOs, MDs, often set piece sort of interviews on something like the Today program. Do you think brands offer up their chief executives, their MDs, enough for big interviews?
It could do more. Today, I notice is now rather following 5 Live in the case study. Is much more interested in, 2 reasons. One is it's sort of, fear of being caught out of being too London Southeast centric. And I noticed in the trail that they've just done for the Today program, where they talk about how it's a very accessible program, which isn't actually necessarily the first word probably that would have come up before. And when I was there, that was the criticism, that I'd made it too rarefied. But I was always on this sort of, on the David Blunkett principle, you wanted to learn something. But I think, so I think it is more, it's much more sort of, human and everyday now. But I would have thought, so it may be that starts to then change the overall tone, and it maybe then you are in a slightly less pressured, sort of rarefied atmosphere. It becomes more conversational, and I think that's certainly tonally, I think that's what they're heading towards, for it to become more conversational. So it may be that in a 6 months' time or a year's time, it's a slightly different program, and that might encourage CEOs to come in a more human guise.
Interesting. Do keep your questions coming in. At Broadcast Revo is our Twitter account, at Broadcast Revo. Lots of questions coming in already, which I'll ask you about. And as I say, everyone who asks a question automatically gets entered into our quarterly draw for a free Broadcast for Good campaign, where we'll deliver a free campaign to a charity of your choice. If you were going on the Today program, what preparation would you do ahead of an interview? Someone's going to be, frankly, quite terrified about going on the Today program. What preparation should they be doing to be a good interviewee?
Quite a lot, actually. I would think, because one thing is just that simple thing of, what do you want to say? What do you want people to? What's your message? What do you want people to hear? Because what you tend to do, and I do it naturally, is you want to please the interviewer, so you'll kind of slightly get dragged into their stream and start answering questions which maybe aren't particularly what you wanted to talk about and aren't getting your message across. So I think so I do think rehearsal is good, and I always thought it was a slightly unfair advantage that the presenters had, that they're all doing role play on the big interviews, and the guests always, of course you saw that with Prince Andrew, and it's most spectacular. Someone who hadn't prepared. So definitely sort of really think through what you want to say. And also I would think on the sort of, remember the speed of it. One thing about radio is it's much faster and than on television. Television, slightly you're sort of sitting back and you can take a little bit more time, whereas radio, you're always speaking much faster than is normal. Actually, if you listen to the Today program, on the sort of speed of it, it's probably, I don't know, but it's probably about half again, the normal speed at which people talk. So really, you have to sort of think about what you're going to say, and then what the one thing you want to say, and then you could add on probably 2 more. But you know, you really do need to sort of keep control of that, because otherwise you're totally in the hands of the interviewer.
On your watch,
Well,
you
one
had...
thing, sorry, I would say on the Today programme, you will get a call from a producer before, and make the most of that, because they will then write down what you said to the presenter and so on. So that, you know, so they do have a sense of what you want, to say. So that actually the producer call is incredibly important.
And I think it's a good chance to ask any producer, if you're having that sort of briefing call for whichever program you're going on, ask some questions if you're unsure about format or how you should actually be. Not everyone is thinking about being in vision, but as we talk about, there are webcams and things like that these days. A producer is there to reassure, and in terms of the technicals as much as anything else. Sure. On your watch, you had to find a successor to John Humphreys. How challenging was that, or rather you were losing John Humphreys? How challenging was that as you look at the evolution of presenters for the Today programme?
Actually, if you see things in the long, if you take a long view, and John Humphreys had been there for 30 years, it's an extraordinarily long time to be doing that. And actually, once he left, we stay in touch a lot. You know, and one thing he keeps saying is, "Why did I stay so long?" You know, so when I arrived, the first thing we did was celebrate the I think it was the 60th years of the Today programme, and I did it partly because I love archive, and so just actually hearing, if you want to get a sense of kind of, you know, social history, it's the stuff, it's what the BBC has, and I don't think makes nearly enough use of, you know. So you can hear Richard Dimbleby, you know, in that, you know, that amazing World War II report, and you can hear how John Humphreys used to speak, you know, 20 years ago compared to now. And so we did, you know, we did sort of how's Britain changed over the 60 years through the Today programme, from, you know, accents to politics to you know, to foreign reporting, and just used a ton of archive. But it made you know, so it made John very sort of reflective, and we used to have, you know, by the end of it, before he left, you know, everyone expected him to be this, you know, tremendously sort of you know, aggressive Rottweiler figure. And while the others were slightly, you know, pumping up ready for their political interviews, he would, you know, honestly be sitting down and going, "So which books would you recommend? And, you know, what do you think about farm salmon?" and so on. I said, "Look, could we just talk about the programme for it?" So in a way, what he'd realised, and it's a terrible moment of realisation because it's very hard to go back to it, is that there's life beyond news, you know, and that, that there's a sort of hinterland. And of course, he went off and is now very happily doing a programme on Classic FM. But I think so, just thinking what's the right thing for, and the other thing is it's you know, it's quite daunting for those presenters, you know, that they're, as someone said, you're sending them out onto the ice, you know, each day, and if something goes wrong, you know, they're the ones that people hear. So I'm sympathetic towards the presenters, but I think, you know, explaining to them that you want, you know, the best from them, which is in their interests, and the best for the BBC, which is another thing that I did with John, actually, not just overseeing his departure, but getting him to drop his salary by half. So I thought that was quite an achievement.
Yes, you had a busy 3 years, gender pay row almost in your first summer, I think, as well. So many different challenges. I want to switch to the questions that are coming in, and we've got a lot. So if you want to give a relatively short answer to some of these, feel free, because we can rattle through a few of these. Let's start off with Alice's question. What do you need from a press officer? If somebody is watching this press officer role, what do you need from the Today programme from a press officer?
You need to know as briefly as possible, you know, what the story is, who the guest is, and that's an important one. And don't you know, just be direct. Don't try and sort of flam things up. You know, just kind of as it is. You know, people haven't got much time, so if you say, you know, there's a big story happening today, we have a guest, you know, who's absolutely at the center of this. This is my number, this is my, so we just need, names, numbers, and what it is, when the producers do a briefing for the presenter, it's basically, why are we doing this item? What do you want to get out of the guest? And how to pronounce the name. That's just go for the basics.
From Paul here, in terms of a good story being a good story, how does the Today programme prioritise the wealth of stories that you must get pitched on a daily basis? Well,
one that is, it's a sort of rolling process. So you have, so a running order at, 11:30 will look very different from the running order at 6:30 in the evening. That was, one of the things I discovered about the role is that it just seems to be never ending, and the day is it's a very long arc of a day. So there's an obvious thing of breaking news or just what feels fresh, at the time. And that's another thing that, sometimes is worth kind of keeping back a story rather than, throwing it in when there's so much, obviously something else going on. So it is worth thinking about, quiet news days, bank holidays, Sundays.
Letter asks, what are your top tips for PRs pitching into a BBC broadcast programme like the Today programme to get their pitch noticed? I mean, is there something that you noticed in your sort of 3 years where you went, oh, that was clever, that was a clever pitch that really grabbed you?
I mean, this, the story sort of tells itself. If it's a guest that you think, oh, that would be a really interesting person to have on, that's obviously makes a big difference. Know good times to get in touch, and you need to understand a bit about rotas. People tend to cling on to one person that they speak to, and then kind of go, where are they, because of the rota of it's a 24-hour program. So if someone was on on a Tuesday night and a Wednesday night, they probably won't be in on a Thursday, and so on. So probably send it to the to as it were, the desk. And you can always do sort of add on to producers if that they have a particular interest.
Clara asks, actually, on planning and timing, how long in advance is ideal for an embargoed news release? Is it better to send it in a few days before the embargoed date, a day before? It's all about the timing. What would you advise?
Yeah, sort of it depends. Probably your concentrate, probably 2 days is good. There's no point doing a week before because you're thinking about the next day's program all the time. But on the other hand, there is someone who's doing planning, and so they're always a good person to get in touch with. And then and you do need, particularly when I was there, as I say, I introduced a sort of discipline that you had a skeleton program which was planned, that you could then add on. You could always throw it out, but you start with the program. So it's and certainly where there's something that's a long time in advance of a book coming out or something, it's worth getting that on the track so quite early. So embargo, if it probably 2 days in advance is good.
2 days in advance. From Emma, nature loss, climate change, big issues of our time. How did you address these? And was it hard convincing colleagues of the need to do so? I mean, I'd add to Emma's question, what do you think are the big themes for the Today programme in particular?
Yes, climate. I mean, climate is a sort of natural one for the BBC. So you're with a sort of sympathetic audience. I think that the trouble is that it's huge and it's abstract in some ways, so it's finding the different ways of coming at it. So we did, actually, when I was there, we did a program from the Arctic and the Antarctic, and we did quite a lot from to bring it to life, actually, so that so we spent quite a lot of sort of capital on that, and but it's then whether you also do it in a more sort of practical way. It's just finding different approaches. So heat pumps, I guess, would be something that would absolutely that has an everyday effect on people and their homes. So you could do something like that, or you could do you can do it big, you can do it small, which actually is something Greta Thunberg, we did a guest edit with her while I was there, and her, that was her view, is that not to make it so that it didn't seem your responsibility anymore because it's just too big.
A few questions coming about thought for the day. I think it was the first question I had here was actually, when would it be got rid of? I absolutely loathe it. Is one here, but actually Joanna asks, is it possible to pitch for thought for the day? How far ahead do they need to come in? Does it go to the main editorial team? Thought for the day, is it completely separate from the editorial agenda and decision making of the program?
It's a good decision. Yes, it is. And it was, so when I first arrived, I thought, what if you made Thought for the Day really good? And you had it as a little sort of wreath lecture. And you, so I brought in someone to sort of help me come up with a cast of who would be brilliant to people around the world. And we would really hone it and we would make it, since it was there, actually the thought for the day. I think it was Simon Russell Beale who said that actually shouldn't the whole program be a thought for the day? But it's run separately. So I had a few run-ins with the department of wanting to try and have some input, also because it's a very, very peculiar constitutional item where the presenters aren't allowed to refer to it. It just comes on its own and it goes. So there's absolutely no relationship with the rest of the program, and yet it does provide something, as some people have said. It's a little oasis of meaning amongst news, and so so at your peril, I think you would get rid of it. Actually, so when I raised it, I think it was with Richard Eyre, who used to be on the board, and I went, I'm just thinking about Thought for the Day. Should I get rid of it or just have humanness or something? And he said, please don't touch it. There will be questions in Parliament.
I was going to say that was the significance of your role, is if you make it minor adjustments, there can be questions from MPs.
Yeah, I know. So but there was always a little collection of tremendously polite people outside. I think they did about once a week, of the Humanist Society. And they would give out leaflets as you went past, and I always took one, and we had a little chat, So it will be very interesting if and when it goes. But I did become quite fond of some of the contributors who were terrific. And actually, during COVID, it became rather important because people were thinking about spirituality. And in fact, when I left the program, I went and published a book called The Interior Silence, which was about the monastic lessons. So it must have affected me in some way.
John asked a question: how would you suggest a trade union leader or the head of an NGO secures an interview from the Today program? On the Today program,
I think there's a natural sympathy. I think it tends to be, again, what's the story, and it's something I've discussed with some of the NGOs. Is it that you have some research about a particular plight, or that that needs to be a sort of initiative? Often it's to do if there's trouble if there's a conflict zone, say Yemen, and you're working within it and you can bring some testimony from it, that really works. So I think it's in a way sort of collaborating on news.
What role can charity spokespeople play on the program? What makes a good charity spokesperson?
Again, I think it's what insight you bring into the national fabric, societal fabric. So it's what insight you can bring into what's happened to children during children's mental health during COVID, or whatever it is. So I don't think you would just say, oh, I'm the head of a charity, I'd like to come on tomorrow, talk about my charity. It has to relate to something. So just think what the news story might be.
Amelia asks, going back to pitching, is there anything in PR pitches that are a real big no, a real big turn off? How does the production team feel about phone calls versus email pitches as well?
Emails are better because phones, particularly if you're on a desk and you're trying to work and there are no receptionists, it's just people picking phones up. So there's always one phone ringing in the distance. And so if it's, which you tend to be, if it's Frank Gardner or someone phoning in with a story, that's what you would expect. But if it's a PR, you can always hear the slight tension because people are concentrating on what they're saying. And I think put something in an email, which particularly one that goes to the whole desk, so that someone will read it, and you can then follow up with just to check that you got it and so on. But I think just remember that people are concentrating; they don't have much time, and so I'm afraid also the "how are you" construction always drives journalists mad.
I ask a question and then I add in Becky's question here. We hear a lot from educators or ministers or whatever, but rarely from students. Are students among your listeners? I suppose I'd frame that really as, what is the average Today listener in your mind, and in particular, their age?
Well, students are interesting. So one thing I did was to set up university broadcasts so that we went around the country from universities, because it meant that you were in a place that you could have access to whatever the local stories were, but it had a kind of energy to it, and it was, and I thought, well, who's going to be interested in the Today programme? Students, and particularly those studying politics or those subjects. So actually I set up a media award, a Today programme awards for students, so that we actually got them in as well, working among us. And as sort of apprentices. So I'm very keen on students, and I think, again, just think of over the last year, their stories have been very relevant of how they're coping with COVID, how they're coping with education, and so on. So I think just trying to line everything with news. That's the overall message.
I think 5 Live, we always considered the average age of somebody listening was around 47, sweeping sort of age, but 47 it was. Average age of a listener for the Today programme would be?
I would have thought it would be late 50s or mid 50s, but I think that it doesn't exclude the younger, and so that you'd get some dedicated younger audience. So there's a big drive to try and get younger people, but it's how you can do it without annoying some of the older listeners. So if you suddenly just turned it into Radio 1, you would lose all your older listeners. And there's also so there's a question: is it a kind of rite of passage as you become a Today programme listener, or can you get? I always thought, could you get a sort of golden thread of actually getting them as students and then seeing them through? But the Today programme, as with all other bits of the BBC, is now so committed to total inclusivity, and that's quite hard to just say, we have to appeal to just everyone in one programme. Luckily there are 3 hours, but
we're fast running out of time. Just a couple more questions for you before we wrap things up. From Charlotte: how has the news agenda, the needs of a newsroom, changed during the pandemic? I mean, I'd kind of add to that, how do you see things moving on? Because we're finding a lot of almost producers are tired of talking about the pandemic now, because I think they know listeners are wanting to hear fresh things as well. How do you see it going forward in terms of people approaching the Today programme and looking ahead?
Well, the big release, and certainly for reporters, will be travel again. So if you can just start, I listened with dismay that the Today programme didn't have its own bespoke team for the American election and so on. And I just think reporters just want to get out, they want to travel. Lise Doucette is one of my favourites, and she seems to have been totally unaffected by COVID. She's always on. But I think that sense of, you're right, just sort of widening the agenda, we have to get beyond COVID and start talking about other things. I think that will be the big relief.
Do you miss it?
I stay in touch with the team, and I feel I have a very nice relationship as a listener. I don't miss at all working there. I loved it, but 3 years was what I wanted to do. That was fine.
But you still listen? I
still listen, of course, yes.
And the future holds for you what, moving forward?
Well, I'm doing a mix of things. I'm working as a board director of Hawthorne Advisors, and I'm on a couple of boards. Index on censorship's important to me. I am chairing a think tank, Bright Blue, and and I'm writing still. So it's a very nice mix.
Sarah, it really has flown by. Thank you so much for your time this morning. It was a real painting a picture on the world of the Today programme.